So we've both been playing a lot of Expedition 33 the last few weeks, and I have to say, this is a pretty solid game, but it's weird because 20 years ago, it feels like we would have got a game that's on par with the quality of this game about every month or so. Yet in 2025, if you follow what YouTubers and game journalists say, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that this game is anything short of an absolute genre-defining masterpiece.
Oh yeah, the YouTube boys are falling all over themselves to tell you what a masterpiece this is, and I'm suspecting a lot of these takes come from tourists who don't know that everything this game does has been done before, like 20 years ago.
Well, it's interesting because there's been a lot of discourse about how turn-based games are boring, but this is the first one to actually make it fun and exciting. To give you guys a bit of background info, I'm not the biggest turn-based guy myself, although Kodo, you have played quite a bit of turn-based games and definitely enjoy them.
Yes, love them. I want to see more of them.
But it's funny because people keep saying that this is redefining turn-based battles, and finally turn-based isn't boring anymore because it has these real-time mechanics. But as you said, there have been real-time combat mechanics in turn-based games since at least Super Mario RPG back in 1996. This is not new. And if you even want a recent example, Sea of Stars, which just came out in the last few years, has offensive quick-time events and time defensive options that can reduce incoming damage as well. But let's not waste much time and just get right into it. And for that reason, let me give a quick spoiler warning. Because we're going to be talking about bosses and enemies in the next section that you may not have gotten to yet. If you haven't finished the game, finish it, come back and watch this later. It's full spoilers ahead. When it comes to the combat in this game, the main combat mechanic is going to be the parry and dodge system. While the dodge is far less risky than the parry gives you a counterattack that can net big damage. My strategy was essentially parry everything, but as soon as I took a hit within a combo, then I would switch to dodge, because if you miss even one hit of the combo, you don't get the counterattack, so there's pretty much no point.
Yeah, right. So I would just dodge everything, because my party was strong enough that I didn't need to do the parry nonsense. I didn't need to.
What a virgin. Real Giga Chad's parry. I have a feeling that the reason I parried so much in this game is because it is very satisfying, and I think that's probably the reason why so many people are overhyping this game to the degree that they are, is, you time the hits in the combo just right, you hear the whoosh, whoosh, whoosh every time you hit a parry inside the combo, and you see the really swaggy and, nice looking counterattack animation, and people see this and they just can't help but squeal 10 out of 10.
Yeah, baby.
The parry does sound satisfying and look great, but it's kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, on one hand, you can beat encounters above your level with pure skill and not using any strategy whatsoever because the defensive options are so strong. And I find that it often cheapens a lot of the offensive gameplay because typical turn-based strategy doesn't really matter if you could just dodge and parry most attacks.
And to that point, in a lot of traditional turn-based JRPGs, there's a level of strategy in terms of setting up your turns and focusing on certain enemies based on when their turn's coming up. And this game does have a bit of that. A character like CL has a move called Fortune's Fury, which can double another party member's attack damage. And she has a move called Intervention, where you can give another member AP and let them attack immediately. So there certainly are ways to have strategy on the offensive end of this game. But unfortunately, you could press a random button every turn on offense and have no clue what you're doing. And as long as your parry and dodge skills are on point, you'll still win every encounter.
Right. I think they're a bit overtuned in how strong they are.
Another quick thing about this system is that there are some nice sound cues to help you parry and dodge, but a lot of times the visual cue for when you need to parry is inconsistent with the actual audio cue that you get. There will be times that you need to dodge much later than it visually feels like you should if you follow the audio cue, which I found tended to be more accurate. There's another little system in combat called the free aim shot system. This system feels a little bit underbaked because it does have a unique utility for certain enemies, like there's some bosses such as Goblu where he summons these flowers that will heal him, and you shoot those to keep him from healing. It's also neat that you can combine the free aim shots with certain pictos to get effects like burning or mark that enhance that. But outside of that stuff and just the typical JRPG cancer flying enemies that can only be dealt with that way, there's not much to this system. Let's talk a little bit about the character builds and customization as well, and I think the easiest place to start there is the Pictos system. In this game, you have these items called Pictos that give you certain effects for your character. Once you get a new Pictos, if you win 4 battles with that Pictos equipped, that allows you to master it, which means now, for a certain cost, you can get the effect of that Pictos without having to equip it in one of your 3 slots.
And when you learn it for one character, when one character masters it, all of them now have access to it.
And the way that you're actually able to equip it is another system called the Lumina Point system. And the more Lumina Points you have, the more Pictos you can equip, and the more different effects you can kind of stack and combine for crazy combinations. And one of the more interesting aspects of this is you can become so insanely broken with the right Pictos and weapon setup. For example, Verso has a weapon called Dualiso that lets him do a basic attack and then still get a second turn. And you can equip all these different Pictos that make his basic attack stronger, make his basic attack, add negative effects to the enemies. It can be super, super strong.
Yeah, that's the build I ran for most of the game, and I just breezed through everything. It was so strong.
Or Mael, who's one of the strongest damage characters in the game. There's a weapon you can get with her pretty early on that allows you to start in her stance that makes her do double damage, and it is insanely strong and can absolutely nuke enemies, specifically towards the end game if you have the right Pictos setup. Now, the stat system did feel quite lacking, and it's funny because we had far different experiences in this game because I built my characters like really, really balanced, put points into vitality and defense and speed and might, and so it took me a lot longer to kill bosses that you actually just breezed through because you poured all your stats into might plus the stats that scaled with your weapons.
Yeah, well, I noticed it takes a while for the scaling to come online. I think it's not till like A that scaling actually starts to really make a big difference. And you're better off just dumping, at least I found, you're better off just dumping your points into might because you get the most damage that way. And why would you focus on defensive stats when you already have an overpowered dodge and parry for your defensive options? It made all the sense in the world to me to just stack might until the scaling came online.
Yeah, it became pretty obvious later for me that once you get good enough weapons, the optimal way to build every character is to just dump everything into the weapon scaling stats and might, and just ignore vitality and defense, because you're going to get Pictos, especially in-game, that give you crazy amounts of HP and defense.
Well, that's part of the problem with putting points into stats, is that a Pictos is just so much better, so much stronger, and so much more worthwhile than any stat investment you will make.
I will say this, I did enjoy that you can respec characters at any time, and it is tied to a consumable, but it's at least fairly plentiful enough that I never had any issues being able to respec when I needed to.
Oh, yeah, I can appreciate that. Well, because whenever they give you the option to invest in stats, like, I was sitting there thinking, okay, what do I even do with this? And am I going to mess this up? So for a while, I had no clue what to do. Thank goodness they're very generous with the respecking items.
We also need to mention the individual kind of character mechanics that each character has. Some of them are pretty cool, some of them are quite underbaked. Like, take Lune's stains. They're a cool idea, but there's so little variation with them. Because the idea is you use a certain element spell, and then you need to consume a certain element spell to use a different element. So, fire stains sets you up to be able to use lightning, ice stains sets you up to use earth, but unless you're running the build where she ignores elementals, it's pretty straightforward. There's not much variation. Or same thing with Mael. She has these 3 different stances, but Virtuoso stance is so far and away better than offense or defensive stance. You should focus on getting into that stance 24/7, not even messing with the rest of it.
It falls into the same trap that a lot of other tactical RPGs fall into, which is that there is just one option that blows everything else out of the water.
Verso's gimmick allows him to gain ranks in something called Perfection, which just gives him new added effects to his moves that let him do more damage and other positive effects. But this also requires you to not get hit to maintain the rank. I think Minoko's gimmick is probably the best one, where he has what's called the Bestial Wheel, and every time you do a move, the cost of the move advances your notch on the wheel that many spaces, and depending on what part of the wheel you're on, is what moves will get an added effect. So there actually is some strategy to using his wheel as opposed to some of the other character gimmicks. It does feel like this game took heavy inspiration from Final Fantasy X, and one thing I feel they could have taken from that game that would have improved this one is allowing you to swap in members of your party in situational times instead of only being able to bring in your last two when your main party gets wiped. It would have added additional levels of strategy offensively. Now I want to get into one of the more interesting things here, which is the enemy and boss design. And for this discussion, we'll stick to story content only, not post-game. I think there's pretty solid enemy variety throughout the game. I will give them this, there are some really cool designed enemies. Like there's an enemy called the Contortionist that has exposed weak points that you can shoot with the free shot system, but once you expose it a couple times, it'll change stances to make it much harder to hit. Or there's other enemies called Greatsword Cultists that will stab themselves and damage themselves, but they get a bunch of shield stacks off of it that you have to burn through to damage them. Now, on the other hand, there are a lot of enemy designs I don't care for. The Gestural Merchants, while not hard, I basically never lost one, but they had some of the worst telegraphs in this game. They were so hard to read because they had such an odd delay on all their attacks. And then there's some later game enemies called the Clair enemies, and they have some of the most obnoxiously delayed attacks that really only exist to try to visually trick you and get you to press dodge or parry early.
Yeah, those feel a little malicious, and I'm not a big fan of this design, although, again, because the defensive options are so strong, if they had not done this, the game would have been a breeze. So I really think it would have worked out a whole lot better for this game if they had weakened the defensive options from the start, so that you don't have to pull all this tomfoolery just to get one over on the player.
Well, and I think with like the Clair enemies I just mentioned, they have dual swords where some of their combos, one sword will light up and then they'll strike, and other combos, each sword will light up and strike on totally different timings. And I think just the fact that before every enemy attack, you actually get a little text pop up telling you which combo the enemy's about to perform kind of shows that these attacks aren't reactive if they feel the need to tell you, hey, this one is going to be this combo, this one's going to be that combo. Because a lot of attacks aren't reactive enough for you to just react to.
At least not in the first viewing, because it does kind of encourage rote memorization. That once you see it and know its properties, and like, okay, I got it now. I have to ignore my lying eyes. Whenever he winds up a strike, I wait a second and then I dodge. It does kind of lead you to the conclusion that they aren't as reactive as they need to be or should have been.
I think one thing that can be a little frustrating with the way they do this is, although the enemy variation is nice, it feels like at times you learn nothing from encounter to encounter when you face new enemies, because until you learn the new enemy's timing, nothing you did in the previous fight will apply to this new fight. I found this to be true for the bosses as well. They were kind of a mixed bag. You have some bosses like Evok, who's the intro boss to the game, the end of the first area. I really enjoyed him. He had solid telegraphs that kind of let you get used to the parry dodge system, specifically his ground spell, that it can hit the whole team, so that can be devastating early on. It's very clear when it's hitting to kind of get you used to parrying and dodging.
Well, it gives you a rhythm to adjust to before the attack ever hits you, so you can predict when it's coming, because it's very well telegraphed, which is what you want out of an intro boss.
Or the Lampmaster. I thought this was a really cool boss, because he kind of had this interesting gimmick where he had multiple arms holding lanterns, and they would light up in a certain order, and if you shot them with the free aim system in that order, you could prevent his giant swipe party wipe move that was extremely threatening and definitely wiped me the first time I fought him.
Yeah, it was a good implementation of the free aim system. I wish they had done more things like this.
Or you had the Paintress. She has some pretty threatening high damage attacks, but most of them have a really good rhythm and timing, and even the times that she breaks the rhythm to throw you off, it doesn't really feel malicious, because it still has pretty clear telegraphs and sound cues. But on the other hand, there were several bosses that I did not enjoy fighting, and I found to have either lazy or bad design. Like one of the early game bosses, Francois, while he was quite easy, his gimmick was really dumb and boring. He only has one move, and it's a guaranteed one-shot at the level you're at when you fight him. But this is the only move he has, so after he hits you the first time or two with it, you're going to know the timing and you'll parry it easily. He presented no challenge, but at the same time was still kind of a dumb fight because he only had one move, and it wasn't particularly hard to dodge or parry once you saw the timing once or twice.
Yeah, I think he's kind of a meme boss more than anything.
Or you have Visages later in the game. I found that this guy had some really poor telegraphs, because he has certain moves where he uses a mask, and things just kind of come out. They will have a sound cue, but visually, there's no real indication when certain moves are coming out. And it doesn't help that he is gigantic, so on some of his moves, the camera is so zoomed out that it obfuscates certain moves even more and makes them kind of harder to react to. And then the final example would be Renoir in his final version, so the final boss of the game. He had some combos that had this really offbeat rhythm, where he would have a hit within the combo where he just holds his sword above his head for a long time to get you to dodge or parry earlier and then get hit, but then like his next swing would be super fast.
Oh yeah, he pulled the market nonsense where he's like, I'm gonna get you, I'm gonna get you, I'm gonna get you, I'm gonna get you, gotcha.
And I'm totally aware that he's the final boss, but you could still find a more interesting way to make his moves threatening than just, hey, learn the timing.
No. Father Miyazaki must be praised.
And speaking of Miyazaki, I have to think he was consulted on this game, because a lot of the boss and enemy designs look like they're ripped straight out of a From Software game. I mean, just look at the Lampmaster.
Well, I really think it's just the Japanese in general, just, I don't know what their obsession with hands is, but everything is hands with Japanese media. Hands and eyeballs.
Well, not to mention, Lune is shoeless the entire game, and Minoko collects feet off Neverons to learn new moves. Something ain't right here.
My, what lovely feet.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
The final kind of little gameplay thing I want to look at here is pointless mechanics. And this is a huge pet peeve of mine, because I hate when there are mechanics in games that add nothing to the game. And I would start off with the platforming. This feels like it was put in as a complete afterthought. It's stiff and clunky. It really reminds me of Doom Eternal, where it doesn't fit with the rest of the game. And in this game, it serves no purpose besides these little challenges that you can do to get cosmetics.
This one just feels like it was made just to frustrate you, because for whatever reason, every time you land on another platform after doing a running jump, your character will roll and completely screw you over. This just feels malicious.
Well, it only exists to give you a couple unnecessary deaths and annoy you.
Right. It feels like streamer bait.
Another pointless mechanic to me was the first strike utility, where when you're running around in the open world, you can hit a button to attack the overworld enemy and give you the first strike in battle, but it is like almost impossible to fail this, and the rare times I ever missed this, the enemy still didn't even get to me fast enough that I was able to back up and do it again and still get it. There's also already a 5-cost Pictos that gives you automatic first strike going forward, so it totally invalidates this mechanic. In some areas, there's these little things called paint cages as well, and if you've played God of War 2018 or Ragnarok, this is a copy-paste of the Nornir chest, where Kratos has to throw his axe at 3 different icons to unlock the chest. Same exact thing, you just free shot 3 glowing areas around the map, and I have to say, it is purely a time waster. There is no substance here. I would rather you just put a chest I can open. The final thing I get is a JRPG staple, but I still hate it, and that is the forced loss fights. These just do nothing but waste time. Like, whenever Gustav faces off against Renoir, or after the party defeats the Paintress and her little outro section, you just sit there and basic attack repeatedly. The fight doesn't matter. Just make this a cutscene. I feel like that's been a pretty sufficient wrap-up of the main combat systems in the game. I want to touch on the exploration and the endgame just a bit. When you're not in combat, you'll be in the overworld. And I felt that early on, the overworld was kind of a nice change of pace to break up the monotony of repeatedly doing the turn-based battles. But it feels like the further the game goes, there are way too many empty worlds that you go through a portal. The camera never even changes from the overworld view, and the only thing inside the world is like a Lumina Point or a Pictos. There's nothing else of interest in there.
Yeah, it's also, like, the world is just way too big and way too empty. I feel like less would be more. Not to mention, when you look at the map doesn't really tell you what the area's level is, or if you've already cleared it, or things like that, so it can be really easy to forget where you've been or where you haven't been and where you need to go, because there's not really a lot of indications to tell you, okay, you've already done this, you haven't done this, so go here. You know what I mean?
Yeah, as you said, it would have helped a lot for the map to be much more dense. And I will say, even with those criticisms, there are a couple of standout optional areas that were really cool. such as there's this yellow harvest area, which is like a forest where there's a mountain and there's a giant Nevron eating the mountain. It's got some pretty cool bosses in it and some fun stuff you can do. Or there's another area called the Reacher, which is this giant wooden tower that has these Nevrons trying to knock it down. And there's some pretty cool lore in it once you reach the top. So they clearly made some pretty cool things out in the open world. It's just the vast majority of it feels more like filler than substantive content. And within the actual areas, if I was going to touch on the level design at all, it has a bit of the feel of the kind of hallway simulator, kind of Final Fantasy VII Remake or Final Fantasy 15 feel, where there are these branching paths so that you can get extra upgrades like weapons or Pictos or Lumina points, but at the end of the day, it's still all very linear hallways with just small branching paths.
Well, and there wasn't a lot of landmarks to differentiate various areas, so like I would constantly find myself backtracking accidentally. It's hallway into big open area with multiple other hallways. So I really feel like we could have benefited a lot from a mini-map, just to help you not waste time.
I totally agree. I would have loved a mini-map, just so I could know, oh, I've been to the circle area. Okay, I'll go to the straight area. And for the My Immersion crowd that's going to screech about adding a mini-map and ruining their immersion, you can just make it optional, so y'all can still keep it turned off. And one specific example that I really hated of level design in this was the Cyrene area of the game. While it looked great and aesthetically I loved the area, that entire area aside from the bosses was so boring and pointless. Every single combat encounter is purely these weak flying enemies that I just spam free aim shots to death on and kill on the opening turn. And mind you, I wasn't over leveled. I hadn't done much side content at that point.
Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking with this one. That was a visually stunning but mechanically unimpressive dungeon, at least in terms of the enemy design.
And let's now touch on some of the in-game bosses. And my biggest issue with the post-game bosses is they felt like they were skewed towards just cheese. When I say cheese, you either one-shot them or they one-shot you.
Yeah, there's no in between.
The balance throughout the game could be rough at times, even just in the story content, but at least the damage caps somewhat kept that in check. But in the post-game, once you get the Pictos to exceed the damage cap at the end of Act 2, the balance goes out the window.
It happens even before that, because I want to say, my Mael at level 15 with minimal investment hit the damage cap. Like, balance is non-existent in this game, and I do mean non-existent. And I don't think we touched on this earlier. Healing skills are pointless. They are pointless. There's no reason to invest in them ever.
Well, most post-game bosses, you're not going to survive the hit regardless. There's no point for them.
Right.
You either dodge it or you die.
Yes. And revive, but don't bother. Don't bother healing that damage.
And like I was kind of saying, you get so overpowered post-game with Pictos like Cheater, which allows each character to attack twice every turn, and these crazy high damage moves like Mael's Stendhal, that you can just nuke bosses before they can ever even attack you.
By the way, Stendhal's been nerfed, and it's still one-shotting like everything in the game.
Yeah,
so now instead of doing 500 million, we only do 50 million.
Which is still more than enough to kill everything, minus maybe one.
Yeah.
And I will say, this can be a lot of fun, and I certainly did enjoy trying out new weapon and Pictos combinations. But it also means the post-game bosses have to be insanely overtuned to even have a chance to combat you in return. Well, and a lot of post-game bosses are really gimmick-heavy, and I don't find fun at all to fight. There's a boss out in the open world called Gross TT. He is a giant boulder that every turn, all he does is a bounce move repeatedly. And so each turn, say in the first turn he bounces 10 times on you, then on his next turn, he'll bounce 15, then he'll bounce 20. And he essentially just bounces repeatedly, forcing you to either dodge or parry over and over and over, until he kind of just gets bored and dies. Once you dodge enough, he just dies. Not a fun fight in the slightest.
Well, I do have to sit back and wonder, like, how did they think this was fun? Did they not test this? Like, maybe in theory I can understand, okay, this may be a neat idea. But then in practice, like, who finds this enjoyable? Who is this for?
There was this flying serpent boss out in the overworld called Sarenfair, and his gimmick was that he has extremely high speed, and he saps your party's AP every turn, so you're mostly relegated to just countering him with parries and just hitting him with basic attacks, which again, kind of robs the fun of the fight. And I will say, I don't have as big a gripe with these in-game bosses being overtuned, since this is optional content just for those who really enjoyed the main game and want to seek it out. But some of these are insanely malicious, and they exist only to force you to memorize every attack, rather than have any chance at actually reacting to them.
They don't want you to engage with the content as much as they want you to play Simon Says and just memorize X, Y, Z, and then repeat. There's no back and forth. There's no like careful preparation. It's mainly just once you learn the enemy attacks, you're completing it instantly. And speaking of Simon Says, there's one particularly malicious boss named Simon.
And Simon is the level 90 kind of final super boss of the game. And again, we're taking into account he's the hardest boss, but man, his combos are super long. And with each new phase, he gets a new sword. So in phase 1, you're dodging these super fast hits in a long combo. But then he switches to phase 2, and every hit hits you twice in really quick succession. And then in phase 3, he gets a third one. So it's 3 hits in quick succession over and over and over again. And depending on your build, almost every hit in every combo will either 1 or 2 shot you. And he has moves within these combos that can party wipe and hit the whole team. And he's got these other dumb gimmicks within the fight where anytime one of your party members dies, he has the ability to wipe them off the canvas so that you can't revive them. They're permanently gone.
Oh, by the way, he does this for free. He doesn't have to have a turn to do this. He will do this in between turns.
On top of that, he also has a move that will reduce a character's max HP to 1. So again, kind of further reinforcing the whole vitality and defense doesn't matter. Invest everything in offense. And probably the dumbest combat mechanic in this entire game is that in his second phase, once you drop him below the 40% health threshold, he has a completely unpreventable move that triggers and wipes your entire party, forcing you to bring in your 2 backups. And the only way this can be avoided is to one-shot him in the second phase. If you naturally get him down to 40%, your main 3 party members die and are gone from the fight, and there's nothing you can do to avoid it.
Well, and then, whenever you get to fight him again with the other party members, you only have 2 instead of 3, so there's a further handicap. It's like, the only way to describe Simon is malicious. It's malicious. And it encourages you to optimize to the point where you break the game and just overcome his crap with your own crap by spamming Stendo.
That's how a vast majority of people who have beaten him. I'm not too proud to say. I gave him the good old college try 5 or 6 times and got bored and said, yeah, I'll just do that. I don't care.
Yeah, I tried him 3 times. Thought, this is ridiculous. I'm not wasting this much of my life to do it correctly. I'm also not going to cheese him with some goofy meta build and not engage with the content. So I just left. I'm not doing this.
Skill issue.
That's what they'll say. That's what they'll say. If you don't want to memorize every move that he has, skill issue.
And don't get it twisted. Anyone can beat him if you commit to learning all his moves, but it's not a fun process. Unless you just like getting pegged. And before we hop into the story, let's just briefly touch on kind of the technical aspects. Visuals, music, performance. I have to say, this game does have gorgeous art design. Just about every area had a really unique aesthetic. Some of the standouts for me were the Flying Waters area, where it's like this underwater ocean themed area that was just really, really cool and looked really good. Or even Minoko Station, which is up in the snowy mountains and has this old railroad system running through it. And I have to say, a lot of recent releases that use the photorealistic Unreal Engine 5 style come off pretty bland, but this still managed to look really good and perform really well.
This game shockingly did run pretty well. It's one of the best running games that I've seen on UE5. It does have a few small hiccups here and there, but mostly it's fine. Now, again, you got to call that out for what it is. It should run fine all the time, but there are a couple dips every now and then when things get busy.
I had occasional stutters, mainly during cutscenes, and some texture popping in the overworld, but for the vast majority of the game, I had no issues. On top of how much I liked how it looked, the character and enemy animations were excellent. All the characters' various skill animations and the counterattack animations after a parry, they're really smooth and they're really stylish.
Now, the one caveat I will say to this is animations outside of combat where you're navigating the open world, like sprinting, jumping, climbing, things like that. Those animations didn't look great, but it's not that big a deal.
Well, and we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the OST for this game is incredible.
Incredible. One of the best I've heard in years. It's an instant classic.
And there's such a wide range of memorable tracks that they really range the whole spectrum of emotions. You have the upbeat kind of synth of the Goblu boss fight, to the mysterious sounding mansion track, to the sad, gloomy sound of the Overworld. Across the board, great. And it's interesting to note that the guy they found to do the OST, they discovered him on SoundCloud, which proves once again there's lots of untapped talent out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of talent out there. You just got to find it. But if you find it, you can save yourself tons of money and have an amazing product in the process as well.
Now, I want to give a special shout out to one track in particular. I will hereby decree that Minoko's theme is the top knee slapper of 2025, even though the year's only halfway through.
Yeah, they ain't topping that. They ain't topping that. There's no way.
And that sax hits. Ooh boy. Although, I must say, for as incredible as the OST is, the audio mixing from when you go from the open world into a battle is absolutely terrible. It goes from reasonable level to blowing your eardrums out immediately. Let's get into kind of our final point here. It's going to be a big one, which is the story. And again, this is full spoilers, so if you don't want to be spoiled, you've been warned. The basic premise is there's this giant cosmic being called the Paintress. Each year, everyone the age of that number that was previously up on the monolith dies. So at the start of this game, 34 is on the monolith, and when she erases it to paint 33, everyone aged 34 dies. This game's narrative follows us being a member of an expedition whose goal is to stop her. Also, the city of Lumiere, which the game starts in, used to be part of a greater continent before an event known as the Fracture, where pieces of the continent, including Lumiere, broke off, which is where the Paintress first originated. So the first really big twist of the story is Gustav's death, who you're led to believe is the main character of the game. And, you know, this kind of works in the moment, but really, really felt hollow by the end of this game.
Well, I mean, even in the moment, it was pretty contrived, but it was one of those things that I didn't see it coming, so it did have some shock value.
At the end of the game, you get to make a choice for which ending you get, and regardless of which one you make, it kind of makes his death feel meaningless. But if you go for Verso's choice, who really even cares? The whole painting's gonna die anyways. Whereas if you go for Mael's, he comes back like nothing happened, but we know the whole painting's fake anyways, so there's really no stakes. And continuing the topic of his death not feeling as meaningful as it should, there's a post-game relationship quest where Mael very abruptly homages the painted version of Alicia right in front of Verso. And it kind of feels like a villain moment for Mael, but then they undercut it by having a conversation afterwards at camp, where Verso reveals that he could have saved Gustav, but he just chose not to. And his reasoning for this really makes no sense, because he never planned to tell the party that they were all fake and were going to be homaged at the end anyways, so Gustav being alive wouldn't have stopped Mael from killing the Paintress. If anything, it'd probably give her more meaning to want to save a guy that she loved. To me, it just feels like a shallow attempt to put Verso and Mael on equal footing to avoid making Mael feel evil because of what she did to Alicia. And moving past Gustav's death, in this story, there's some really strong moments, but some also just mind-numbingly stupid ones. And to look at some of the good writing moments before we look at some of the more baffling ones, the opening of the game before they set off on the expedition is kind of slow, but it does do a good job of setting up the premise, as well as establishing motivations for certain characters like Gustav, because you see the emotional moment of him having to watch his former girlfriend get homaged by the Paintress. There's also a really interesting conversation that Gustav has with his sister Emma right before they take off, where she knows that the expedition is a waste of time because there's already been so many and they've all failed. And her and the powers that be in Lumiere know it's doomed to fail. So she's telling him, please don't go. This is purely for morale. You don't need to die. You're throwing your life away. But he's committed to the cause and wants to stop the Paintress. So it's a It's a nice little character building scene that's done pretty well.
You and I both know the political complexities that necessitate the expedition. It's vital for morale, but it's a bloodless guillotine is what it is.
Two of the really high points of this story are Renoir and Verso specifically. They're very well written and have some really strong moments. Verso as a character is in this constant struggle of wanting it all to be over because he's lived all this time knowing that he isn't real, but also still having this subconscious need to want what's best for his family, even though he knows the memories of this family aren't really his. And then in Renoir's case, he works so well as a character because even though he's played as evil in a lot of ways, he loves his family and will do anything to do what's best for them in his mind. And this is kind of evident towards the end when he's pleading with Alicia to give up on the painting and face the reality of her situation.
Doesn't mean you have to erase Verso's canvas.
Child, do you think I want to? After all the sorrows we've endured, do you really think that I want to destroy this last piece of his soul? You can hate me, but that's a choice I must make. As your father, I must look out for you, especially when you can't look out for yourself.
You treat me as if I'm still 5.
I treat you as if the shadow from the worst day of our lives is going to suffocate you and take you from us too!
It makes him very relatable in that moment.
Right. And he's even risking his health going into the painting to drag his wife out. I mean, he's a very selfless character.
But for as good as those moments are, there's a couple here I want to mention that are just baffling why they thought this was a good idea. I mean, right at the beginning of the expedition, when you first hit the continent, Renoir and all the Nevrons just start destroying the expedition. And a Nevron kills basically everyone around Gustav and then charges up an attack. And right before the attack gets unleashed on Gustav to kill him, we get a camera cut to black, and he wakes up in a completely different area and is fine. And everyone else in the party is also somehow magically okay. The only one that we actually get visual confirmation should be fine is Maëlle, because we see Verso snatch her up. There's another scene later, right before Gustav dies, where Esquier can fly and is said to be one of the most powerful beings in existence. But the reason they have to go to this cliffs area is because Esquier says they need to get Flory so that Esquier can act as a boat and get them across the continent. But he can't do it himself because it would be too much effort to go grab the rock by himself. But then he immediately just mollywops this giant Burgeon Nevron 2 seconds later.
Come on, you can fly. Can't you get Flory yourself?
Oh no, too much effort.
And you know, I'd be a lot less critical of this dumb moment if it didn't lead to Gustav's death, making that feel even more contrived than it already did.
Yeah, that's my main issue with Gustav's death. It's so unbelievably contrived and ultimately meaningless.
Well, and later, when they're at the Forgotten Battlefield, Duelista, who's one of the bosses in the game, dive bombs the bridge they're standing on, and you see in slow motion the party falling to their deaths quite a long distance. But then, again, a camera cut happens, and they're all standing at the bottom of the pit fine, preparing to fight Duelista. There's just no thought given to how these scenes play out. Or another one I know that you particularly hated was when they're in Old Lumiere, there's a building in the way of the path they need to get to, and Verso tells Minoko to deal with it. So he transforms into a giant Nevron, and with no thought or warning, just smashes into the building, potentially injuring or killing party members. And it just creates, again, this contrived reason for the party to separate, to move the plot forward, but it's nonsensical.
Right. They wouldn't get separated. They would be buried under rubble in the same general area.
And based on where the two parties end up, one being Minoko, Lune, and Ciel, and the other being Verso and Maëlle, they would absolutely be close enough to each other to still yell and hear each other, but yet the game treats it as they're miles away.
It's a really strange choice.
And it's incredibly convenient because this leads to A, Lune discovering that Renoir is Verso's father, and gives Verso an opportunity to use Mael as bait to get her near the mansion so that he can get in.
You know, another weird problem we had with the story, and I get people love Expedition 60 because of the memes and their chats and all that, but how did they get through the monolith barrier?
And if you don't know what Koto's referring to, you find different expeditions journals all throughout the game with different stories of their journey, and Expedition 60 are just gym bros who basically have the plan of, we're gonna lift our way into killing the Paintress, which is kind of funny, but these guys like deadlift their way through a magic barrier. It's so stupid.
It's so goofy. And I'm okay with there being like some levity here and there, but don't break the lore of the game for memes, maybe? Maybe put them outside of the monolith instead of in it?
Or again, you could call something like this a nitpick, but it just shows there's no attention to detail. After they defeat the Paintress, right before the kind of final gommage back in Lumiere, Verso is reading Alicia's letter, and when he's done, he throws it into the ocean. But yet, later in Mael's relationship quest, she tells Verso that she read Alicia's letter. So, at some point in that, Mael scuba dived and got that letter out of the ocean.
It's so goofy, man. Like, I don't understand these choices. And I guess the writers don't either. They expect you to be like, oh, well, that happened. Okay, moving on. And it's not even that big of a deal, but for those of us who are paying attention, please don't insult me like this.
And I think my final overarching point on the story here is going to be, it's a really solid premise that had me engaged basically until the end of Act 2, but they kind of throw it all away in favor of these plot twists.
Yeah, I noticed that, and that happens quite often, and it's really frustrating. Because, like, perfect example, after you defeat the Mask Keeper, he basically summons all these masks that incapacitate the party by locking onto their face and causing some weird effect. And it has no effect on Minoko, obviously, because he's a gestural and there's already something covering his face. So you'd think that Minoko would be the one to save the day and defeat him, but nope. CL was like, this mask can't hurt me because I'm me. And just lotus palms him?
So silly.
It's so goofy.
It gets even worse because they go right back to the same well on the next Axon boss, which is Cyrene. She makes this loud sound that incapacitates the party, but for some reason, Lune is unaffected, and Cyrene then sticks out her palm, Lune climbs on, and then Cyrene lifts it up to her face, where Lune just blasts her. And if you'll remember, the intro to this area, Cyrene puts the whole party in a trance, and it is effective on Lune, and once again, Minoko is the only one unaffected, and uses the bell on his staff to snap them out of it. But yet, at the end of it, Lune just, for some reason, is unaffected and kills it.
We just had to have our girl boss moments. You know, this kind of reminds me of that scene in Game of Thrones where Bella Ramsey's character gets grabbed and crushed by a giant, and the giant's like, let me take a closer look, and like brings her up to his face, and she stabs his eye and goes, and like, kills this massive giant.
And the big twist at the end of the story that you find out is that you've been led to believe the Paintress is killing everyone year by year, but we find out this is actually Verso's canvas from when he was a child, and the Paintress, aka Aline, who's his mother, came into the painting after he died and painted fake copies of her entire family to cope with his death. And because he loves her very much, her husband Renoir comes into the painting to try and break her out of it, but she won't leave. So he locks her in the monolith, and year by year starts destroying her oldest creations to reclaim the chroma that she needs to power the canvas. And in turn, she traps him beneath the monolith. Now, what's weird is it's stated that Renoir painted the Axons to keep chroma away from Aline and limit her power. So why exactly would he want them killing the Expeditioners, since if the Expeditioners succeeded, they would defeat his wife and get her out of the painting, which is what he wants.
Yeah, I had similar questions. I don't quite understand that choice.
Well, another question I have is, why didn't Alicia revive Gustav? She uses the excuse that, you know, those who weren't gommaged have imperfect chroma, whatever that means. So if she brings them back, they're just kind of zombie men. But that also begs the question, where did she get the initial chroma that let her bring Lune and Ciel back properly?
Stop asking questions, Chud.
Well, the stakes are pretty much dead at this point because Ciel and Lune get snapped out of existence and they're back in 5 minutes.
A few moments later.
I hate that trend in modern media where deaths mean nothing.
It's becoming more and more common, unfortunately.
It makes it concerning whenever things that will do that on a pretty consistent basis also get hailed as masterpieces. So, like, we're just going to keep seeing more of it.
Well, and probably my biggest question at the end of the game that really kind of bugged me was, why are Renoir and Verso even fighting in the first place? They both want Aline and Alicia out of the canvas to go deal with reality. It doesn't make sense for them to fight. They want the same thing. It's almost as if Verso sides with Alicia at this point, but we know from the ending he doesn't really feel that way, and he wants her and Aline out of the painting. And also, once you actually defeat Renoir, it seems so out of character for him to let Maëlle stay in the painting after knowing what's going to happen to her. And they kind of, to me, they make it clear that he doesn't believe Maëlle when she says, oh, I'll just stay for a while and then I'll come back. But yet he still lets her do it. He was one of the strongest written characters the entire story, but I feel like that moment really didn't make sense for him.
I suspect what it was is they just wanted to use Renoir as a cool final boss moment. So they had to make sure you got an obligatory fight with him somehow, some way. Story implications be damned.
And it was a cool boss fight, to be fair, but it could have also made story sense.
We can have both, you know.
Summarize this story, it turns out nothing was real, it's all a fantasy, and the entire story is just about the Desandre family getting over the grief of the loss of Verso. Which again, at that point, stakes are dead.
Well, nothing mattered, ever.
And the icing on the cake is the true ending of this game. You get to make a choice. There's the Verso ending, where Verso beats Maëlle in a fight and frees the fragment of real Verso's soul. And for me and you, this is very obviously the moral ending. And it reinforces why I like Verso so much, because he admits to Maëlle during this fight that he's a liar and a hypocrite, but he still knows this is the right choice. He's cognizant of the fact that part of the reason he's making this choice is so that he can stop being, eternally tortured by the fact that he knows he's not real and that all of this is fake. But this is also the best choice for Alicia and Aline. And alternatively, in Maëlle's ending, if you side with her, I don't see a case you could make that this ending is not evil. Because not only does this allow her and her mother to stay in Fantasyland forever whittling away in the real world, but Verso becomes a prisoner in this ending. There's a quick line that makes Maëlle seem really evil too, when after she defeats Verso, he begs her to unpaint him if she's going to continue to stay in this world, and she refuses because she still wants him in it.
Unpaint me. Unpaint me.
So,
Please. I don't want this life.
stop saying
I
that.
don't want this life. I don't want this life.
I just wanted to live this lifetime together.
I feel like they were really close to this being a pretty good moral dilemma, but Verso's ending is just objectively correct on every front. The only thing that almost makes Maëlle's choices seem semi-reasonable through her eyes is that her real-life self in Alicia has no voice and a disfigured face, but that still doesn't account for the choices she makes. And we get flashbacks towards the end that show that Verso's death happened as a result of a war between the Painters, which is the family we follow, and another group called the Riders. And it's hinted that the Riders used Maëlle, and she made a mistake that cost Verso his life. And I assume they're saving fleshing this out for either a DLC or a sequel. But man, it would have been nice for them to give us just a little something here for us to care about this.
Right. It does seem like a lot of the story and the various mechanics and how things work is left deliberately vague, just so they can have the freedom to do whatever they want to do within it.
And really, really quick before we wrap it up, I do think there are some small hints of modern audience nonsense in this game. That opening festival before the Gommage, there are copy-pasted black NPCs everywhere, and there's even a black expedition member. But he dies in the very opening, and there is no diversity again ever for the rest of the game. It really feels like this was just placed at the beginning to keep the heat off of them from game journalist types that would criticize lack of diversity. The other interesting tidbit here is the game positions the men as the true antagonists of the story once the twist is revealed, but in true woman fashion, the female lead writer of this game made the only two significant men in the story, the rational ones that force the unhinged females to face reality. Like, she is accidentally based.
The message of the story is essentially when you give women power, they will burn down the real world for the sake of preserving a fantasy one. It's actually incredible.
This game's story, written by a female writer, is actually a great case to repeal the 19th. Unironically. We've reached a point where an above-average game is considered an all-time great in the year of our Lord 2025. And I do want to say, I would be lying if I said it wasn't refreshing to play a new release that wasn't a massive disappointment. And I truly do think with a little bit of tweaking to some of the combat depth and design and a more coherent story, especially towards the end, this game could have been something pretty special.
Sure.
But having said that, it's probably the best new release, certainly for 2025 and maybe even 2024 for me. And I will definitely be on the lookout for whatever Sandfall Interactive works on next.